Ramdan, we do a podcast about African books. Have you ever challenged the fact that we do it in English?
Well, sure. It could have been in French.
Well, that's not what I meant.
But yeah, I have a feeling you know exactly why I chose today's book.
Indeed, I believe today's author, Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, might not be a big fan of the language of our podcast.
Let's see.
Welcome to Threads of Africa, a space where African voices, books, and ideas come alive. Each episode, we open the pages of books, narrations, and oral traditions that carry the rhythms, struggles, and dreams of the continent. I'm Hajar.
And I'm Ramdan.
And together we're weaving a richer understanding of Africa, one thread at a time.
So I chose today's book in connection with the last one we talked about. What if Africa was refusing to develop? And if you haven't listened to that episode yet, you might want to check it out because, it's, as I said, linked to this one. So you might want to check it out before listening to this episode or after this one. Because while Axelle Kabou, the author of the previous book, really pushed us to question Africa's resistance to progress, today's author turns that question inward. He asks us to look not just at systems or structures, but at the very ways we think. And he argues that this starts with language, the language that we speak. So the title of the book is Decolonising the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature. It's written by the late Kenyan author and academic, Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, who sadly passed away in May this year. And the book is actually a collection, as he described it, a collection of one paper and two lectures. So it reads like a deep, extended, but a bit technical reflection. So after the introduction of the book, it dives into four main parts. The first part, the title is The Language of African Literature, and the second part, The Language of African Theatre. And part 3 is about the language of African fiction, and the last part is titled The Quest for Relevance. Now, first, let me say a few words about the author, Ngũgĩ Thiong'o. He was a Kenyan novelist, playwright, essayist, and one of the most influential literary thinkers Africa has produced in the last century. He first wrote in English, and later in his life, he made the deliberate and political decision to center his work in African languages. So he wrote in Gikuyu or Kikuyu,
which is local African, Kenyan language, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
So he published Decolonising the Mind in his early 40s at a moment when his political activism and his literary career were colliding in very intense ways. And reading his work, you can feel a deep conviction, almost a sense of urgency from someone who had lived the consequences of colonial education, censorship, and state repression firsthand. Ngũgĩ Thiong'o studied at Makerere University in Uganda, then at Leeds in the UK before returning to Kenya to teach literature. And despite the global recognition he eventually received, he got honorary doctorates, international prizes, and decades of teaching in the US. Despite all of this, he has always held a somewhat paradoxical place in African intellectual life because He was widely cited, hugely respected, but not always widely read, I would say, on the continent, especially among young audiences. And speaking for myself and coming from West Africa, I only discovered him quite late, at least much later than I should have, I think. And I find that gap quite revealing and a little sad because as I was reading Decolonizing the Mind, I kept thinking that these are conversations that deserved to travel much more widely than they did. It should have traveled across regions, across languages, across generations, at least within Africa. But yeah, unfortunately, as I said earlier, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o passed away in May this year, and this is a huge loss for African literature and for global thought more broadly, I would say.
Yeah. And I mean, again, linking to our last episode, we said that Axelle Kabou, the writer or the author of the book that we talked about last time, she also was equally not recognized enough, and that her work didn't get the widespread dissemination it should have given, or it should have got, basically. And we explained it last time that it was due to the very critical or the harsh critique in her book, and especially that she was criticizing the African elites. And Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o's work is, however, very different in tone. It's not as critical, and also it's not kind of criticizing the elites in the same way that Axelle Kabou is. So do you have an idea on why his work wasn't as recognized?
I believe Ngũgĩ's work has been more widely recognized than that of Axelle Kabou.
Okay.
Perhaps because he wrote in English, I don't know. But what I mean is that he seems to have gained more international recognition than recognition within the African continent itself. And to answer your question, yeah?
That's interesting.
Yeah. To answer your question, I think these are relatively old books, which may explain why they are not as popular today, even though they still raise very relevant questions. And I think another reason is that African literature is still not fully integrated into mainstream reading and academic spaces. And that's precisely, I think, what we are trying to address with this podcast.
Yeah, indeed.
So the themes that I will be talking about today, I mentioned earlier that there are 4 parts in the book. The first 2 themes I will be discussing correspond to parts 1 and 2, and the third theme will provide a brief overview of the remaining 2 parts. So part 1, the language of African literature. Right from the introduction, Ngũgĩ states clearly that imperialism is still the root cause of many of Africa's problems. And then he adds something that really caught my attention. He wrote that some African intellectuals, according to him, have fallen victim to how Western media distracts us by shifting attention away from the fact that imperialism is still the root cause of Africa's problems, and instead framing debates in a way that fits Western narratives about Africa. So when I read that, I couldn't help but think about Axelle Kabou, the author of the previous book that we discussed. And even though Ngũgĩ's book came out years before hers, the contrast here the contrast in their perspectives is striking.
Yeah, I thought I was going to suggest that maybe he's addressing his criticism to Axelle Kabou, but you're saying uh, his book came before hers, so he
Yes,
couldn't be
yeah.
talking about her.
I had to check that actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So throughout the book, he refers to African writers who share his position on the legacy of colonial languages. People like David Diop and Obi Wale. And he also brings up those who disagree with him, such as Leopold Sédar Senghor and Chinua Achebe. He also argues that the legacy of colonialism, especially when reinforced by African literature written in European languages, has helped to produce a kind of class division on the continent. On one side, the African peasantry and working class, and on the other, what he calls the European language speaking African petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me not dive too deep into that debate right now.
Yeah, I would say, wait a second, because you introduced a lot of new names here, and I believe we need to kind of take a break and introduce all of the names and the people that you just talked about. So, I mean, Axelle Kabou, obviously, we talked about her a lot by now. She's the author of the book that we talked about in our last episode. So check out "And If Africa is Refusing to Develop." You also mentioned David Diop, who is a French Senegalese poet who wrote fierce anti-colonial poetry. You also mentioned Obi Wale, who is a Nigerian literary critic who made the case for writing in African languages.
Correct.
So as we see, they're both kind of on the side of today's author. And then on the other side, you mentioned Senghor, who is a Senegalese poet, philosopher, and he also was the first president of Senegal.
Yeah.
He is particularly famous for being one of the founders of the Negritude movement, which is a school of thought which, as at its core, affirms the Black and African identity, culture, and humanity in response to colonialism and racism.
Yeah, I mean, might come back to it.
Yeah, I mean that all sounds aligned. However, Senghor especially was much less confrontational in his attitude towards the West and sought dialogue rather than rupture. In opposition to what we will talk about today. He also advocated what he calls cultural métissage, basically cultural mixing, instead of confrontation again. And then last but not least, Chinua Achebe, who is a famous Nigerian novelist who, unlike Ngũgĩ and Wale, actually believed that the colonial language, English in this case, could be reappropriated and reshaped by African. So he's a bit different than Senghor. So he's kind of more towards the confrontation side, but he thinks that the English could be or should be reappropriated by the Africans as theirs.
Yeah, I think Ngũgĩ referred to him a lot, but I think there is a clear difference in the way they approach this issue. But thank you for clarifying. Let me go back to Ngũgĩ. So his way of presenting his arguments is quite straightforward. He builds his case through examples. He makes a point, then immediately grants it in something real, something lived. So when he says that imperialism is still the root cause of many of Africa's problems, one of the examples he gives is education. He explains that in many African countries, the entire education system is still rooted in colonial language. And that's where the problem starts. Because he says there are students who can't pass the exams, not because they are not intelligent, but because they are not fluent enough in the colonial language. And he shares a personal story from 1954 about one of his classmates who passed every single subject with distinction except English. And because of that subject, he failed the entire exam. So that boy, Ngũgĩ writes in his book, eventually became a turn boy in a boss company.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's an extreme case. Well, I believe that is actually still very pertinent until now, even. I remember back at school, there were students who struggled with the sciences and math, mainly because it was taught in French and not in the native language. And the government tried to fix that by Arabizing science and math for some additional years in school. But again, at some point in scholarity, it shifted back to French. So, and that was in high school. So high school was in French again. So the problem will pop up for some of the students at some point, be it earlier or later. And again, I mean, it's not really about which language do you teach in. I mean, like from a government point of view, it's a bit deeper than that, and it's about changing the whole education paradigm, if you want, exactly, and putting all the effort and investment in translating the whole knowledge creation system to the local language. So that includes education at schools, universities, also the creation of research, publications, etc. It's not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, and I think that's a powerful example, right? And honestly, even Axelle Kabou would have a hard time arguing against this.
Yeah.
And Ngũgĩ later expands on this idea, saying that the colonial system created what he calls an elite dome, or if you want, a petty bourgeoisie, a small scale or a small class of people who could only rise if they mastered the colonial language.
Do you know why he calls him petty bourgeoisie? I mean, that sounds like a very contentious name.
Because I guess there is a, bigger bourgeoisie. I don't know, more.
Okay, there's the original bourgeoisie and then the petty one.
Yeah. So, where was I?
Yeah, I mean, the petty bourgeoisie, who are the people who can rise in society only if they master the colonial language, right?
Yeah. So, and for him, this matters deeply because language isn't just a tool for communication. It's a carrier of culture, of memory, of history. And if culture shapes who we are as individuals and as communities, then the language we use to learn, to dream, and to tell stories must also be the language of our own culture. So, for instance, Ngũgĩ explains that education in a colonial language becomes a kind of cerebral activity or exercise, something you do with your head, not with your heart.
Yeah.
And because when you're learning in a language that is not your own, you can't feel the words in the same way. You can understand the logic, but you lose the emotion, the rhythm that or the connection to life around you.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't become intrinsic.
Mm-hmm.
Basically. Yeah, and that's what you mean with the cerebral exercise, right?
Yeah. Yes. And that's the difference I think he's pointing to. Education that trains the mind but sort of disconnects the soul.
Yeah. And I think, it's very relevant when it comes to literature, poetry,
True,
etc., right?
Yeah. Now, you might be wondering why is this first chapter titled "The Language of African Literature"?
Yeah.
It's because everything Ngũgĩ argues in that chapter leads to one central idea, that African literature should be written in African languages. And in his own words, he calls for harmony between all aspects and divisions of language. So, in other words, he's asking for coherence between the language we think in, the language we speak, like we African, and the language that carries our cultures. Because only then, he says, can our stories truly reflect who we are.
And let me put the Axelle Kabou hat here. So, although I totally buy the argument for the localization of education content to ensure that the students, or to ensure the assimilation and of the students and the maximization of the students' capabilities, writing literature in local African languages might be counterproductive for the African unity purposes, if you may say. So, for example, Gikuyu, the language that later the Ngũgĩ will kind of write in, is only spoken by maximum 10 million people in Kenya. So that is even less than the whole population of the country, let alone of the whole African continent. So again, kind of challenging the idea here a bit, I'm not sure how this will contribute to a Pan-African identity and culture. But again, I mean, on the other hand, I do agree that the native language carries the culture much, much better than, say, obviously a Western language. In any case, I don't really have a solution to propose here, but my point is that there is a fine balance between promoting a Pan-African vision and preserving kind of the local language.
Well, and I would dare to disagree here because I think that's what we have translation or translators for. And he also, I will come back to this toward the end. He also gave the example of, because I said at some point in his career, he turned to definitely definitively writing in Gikuyu. And I will get back to this.
Okay. Yeah. But yeah, fair point. Yeah. Translation is there. Yeah.
So let me move to part 2, the language of African theater. The storytelling in this book is very powerful, I found. And you feel the storytelling, the power of the storytelling immediately when he opens the second chapter with an interesting story when he explains how in 1976, a woman from Kamirithu village, I believe it's a village in Kenya, came to his house early one morning, and she went straight to the point by telling him, "We hear you have a lot of education and that you write books. Why don't you and others of your kind give some of that education to the village or the villagers?" And just like that, the community project began in Kamirithu. Together with the villagers, they created a community education and cultural center and eventually a theater. And because this was happening in a village, the performances had to be in the language of the people. So they chose Gikuyu. And that experience was a turning point for Ngũgĩ. It's where he realized that it was not only possible but deeply meaningful to create literature in an African language and to write for a local audience first.
Yeah.
It was also an opportunity for him to immerse himself in the subtleties of Gikuyu, what he beautifully describes as the levels of language and language use and the nuance of words and phrases. And again, I won't dive too deep into the full story here, but what I can say is that it's incredibly powerful. The community project grew so much that, and it attracted such a huge crowd that it eventually got banned by the Kenyan government back then.
Wow.
Yeah. And it also led Ngũgĩ straight to prison.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's an extreme
Yeah. So according to him, this reaction wasn't surprising because he argues that the government at the time was simply continuing the colonial project of suppressing African languages, because the Community Education and Cultural Center was doing something radical. They were giving voice to the so-called peasants. They were giving them access to knowledge. And as we all know, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
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 So to close this part, I want to leave you with a beautiful and haunting paragraph from Ngũgĩ, a paragraph about the community initiative. So he writes, quote unquote, "It has led me to prison, yes. It got me banned from teaching at the University of Nairobi, yes. And it has now led me into exile. But as a writer, it has also made me confront the whole question of the language of African literature, which then led me to confront the language of African fiction."
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a great story indeed. And as you said, the storytelling in this book is amazing. But maybe, again, trying to play the role of the devil's advocate. And this is also a bit related to my previous comment. While I recognize that there is a quote-unquote colonial motive behind the government's banning of theater or basically the theater, which is in Gikuyu language, one can argue that there might be a motive of establishing a national identity in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is that basically by banning the tribal identities, you strengthen the national identity, especially that the African national states in general were quite nascent. This was in the 70s. Kenya got its independence in the 60s. And of course, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, and basically kind of preventing people from access to culture and art is not a good thing. You can establish a national identity without recurring to what I would call in this case kind of cultural violence, quote unquote. And you can still do that with leaving space for diversity. But I'm trying to add nuance to the government's perspective here, because Ngũgĩ's kind of point of view seems a bit too one-sided, I would say.
Well, you definitely got a point. And, as you were speaking, I was thinking that is there a case of any country that kind of, I don't want to say development, I don't want to use the word development, but achieved progress with a certain heterogeneity or linguistic heterogeneity or diversity in the society? Perhaps there is in history, I'm not quite sure, but if you look at powerful nations today and the development in the Western sense today, most of the advanced nations are at least linguistically heterogeneous in a way.
Heterogeneous or homogeneous? Yeah.
Sorry, homogeneous. Yeah.
Yeah.
So backing up your point, but I don't know if there has been any example in the history or this has been achieved with, many languages being spoken at the same time in the same society or the same nation, whatever, however you may define a nation. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
maybe Singapore now, like just thinking about it. Because in Singapore, you have, in theory, 3 official languages: English, Chinese, actually 4: English, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. And even like when you go in the street, you see all 4 languages represented. But again, I mean, like this is a very shallow analysis.
And they also have a language of communication, like a central kind of language.
It's central around English. You're right. Yeah.
So I think she also made the point towards the end of the book that, for instance, in Kenya you could have Swahili, which many people speak. That could be the kind of medium of communication, but also maintain the diversity, which could work, I think, in practice. But researchers in linguistics have to kind of think about these things, and development researchers as well. Anyway, let me briefly summarize the 3rd and 4th parts. In the 3rd and 4th parts of the book, the language of African fiction, the 3rd, and the quest for relevance, the 4th, they are a bit more technical. So I will simply summarize them briefly here. And for those of you who find this topic fascinating, I really encourage you to buy and read the book yourselves. Because by this point in the book, Ngũgĩ has already told us the story of his theater, the work that he has done with the Kamiritu community, and how that project was eventually dislocated by the government. So naturally, he begins asking himself a crucial question, which is, how do I reconnect with the people I write for? And that question leads him to reflect on the literary form itself, novel, whatever, essays. And here he focused on the novel as a literary form of expression. He questions whether the novel as a genre is even the most appropriate medium to reach African audiences.
Yeah.
So one of his main arguments is that the novel has a bourgeois European origin. In Africa, when novels were first introduced, they were tightly controlled by colonial institutions. And after independence, book distribution remained geared towards an urban, English-educated elite.
Yeah.
So in other words, the urban poor and rural communities, which in many African countries constitute the majority of the population, simply did not have access to novels. And again, the solution that he hints toward is writing in African languages. He even shares his own success story, the success story that I was about to tell you at the beginning. Because when he published a novel in Gikuyu, it ended up selling more copies in Kenya than some of the English language books. So see, the language wasn't really a problem because it got translated in other language. I think he mentioned German even.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So that was his proof that African languages can reach audiences and perhaps reach them more deeply. I think at the beginning he gave examples of Russian authors, Tolstoy, and what's the name of the other? Your friend's favorite?
Not Tolstoy. Dostoevsky. Yes, I was googling the book's name. The Brothers Karamazov. Yeah, it's Dostoevsky. Yeah.
Dostoevsky, yes. Yeah, so they have written in Russian.
Yeah.
But he reached, a very large public.
Yeah.
Anyway,
actually,
so
you
that
said,
was
yeah, you said that the novel is not the right format, maybe for African literature. Does he propose an alternative?
no, he didn't say it's not the right format, but he questions it kind of because
Uh,
it has bourgeoisie origins. And then he says in Africa, um, when it was introduced, it could not really reach the majority of the population, the urban poor and the rural population.
yeah,
So
but okay,
ultimately,
yeah.
it's the novel, but it has to be kind of changed. You know,
Mm,
it has to be a new kind of novel, a novel that is accessible to majority of the population. This can be done, by using the medium that the majority of the population uh, speaks, understands,
yeah.
and
Actually, yeah, when you were saying that, I was thinking kind of what are other alternative forms of literature that are more authentic and more indigenous. And I remember, like, when I was a child, my father used to tell me a lot of kind of short stories. And that is a kind of, back then, I think it's unfortunately now a bit of a lost tradition, uh, but again, back then, it's a very common way of it's a very common form or genre of art, like these short stories that like the grandma will tell you, and so on, and which is very much similar to the 1001 Night stories, like short fictional stories with some um, superhumans and like some magic in them and so on. So that could be maybe a format. I was also thinking about West African griot,
which is oral tradition. But he
exactly,
also gave the example of a theater, and it's a genre which worked. And
yeah.
he I just mentioned the success story around that. So
Yeah. So I think, yeah, the point is basically connecting more with indigenous genre, also like, or at least trying to bridge between, yeah, modern and African indigenous formats of narrations.
yeah, I agree. So in his conclusion, Ngũgĩ acknowledges that this won't be easy. See how we are already struggling.
Yeah.
So the politics of language in Africa, with our incredible linguistic diversity that you mentioned, is a complicated challenge, but he insists it's a conversation worth having. I'll stop here.
And so we close our journey through Decolonizing the Mind, the politics of language in African literature, by Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, a revolutionary declaration reclaiming African languages as a foundation for authentic storytelling, identity, and freedom. If this story sparked something in you, pass it on, just like oral tradition. You've been listening to Threads of Africa with Ramdan and Hajar. A bientôt, and stay curious.